Take me to another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical, magical land. Magical, magical land. To another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical, magical land.
Today's guest is a global trustee of the Urban Land Institute. He is an active board advisor for a wide range of organizations related to real estate, urban mobility, energy, and digital design. Prior to founding the outcome-based master planning and program management business OUTCOMIST, he led AECOM's city consulting practice and was appointed as advisor to the mayor of London. Please welcome to the show, Christopher Choa. Hey, Chris, welcome to the show. Great to have you. How are you doing?
Nice to see you, Jens. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. So before we dive into innovation and all the other topics, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What is your story?
Well, probably if I had to sort of really summarize it, I would say I'm a third culture kid. I'm a first generation American. My parents came to the United States as immigrants, really so that I could be born in America. It's maybe that's the beginning. My mother is French. My father was Chinese from Hong Kong. And when I was very, very small, I lived a little bit all over the place in the Philippines and in Hong Kong before settling down in America. So I would say that's probably the first part of who I am. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm one of those creepy people who always knew what they wanted to be when they were younger. So I always wanted to be an architect. And ever since I was a boy, I was always drawing and building and imagining objects and machines. And I eventually wanted to study architecture properly. But before I did that, I studied fine arts when I was in university. So I guess the second thing about me is I love problem solving, but maybe in a spatial way. So not in a linear way. So when you're an artist, you never start in one end and you end up in another end. You're always drawing. You're always starting with a very, very big loose idea. And then gradually parts of it come up and they come into focus and they start to create relationships with other ideas. And you start to play around with symbols as well as depictions and technique. So maybe the third part is I grew up in New York City. I went to a girls' school when I was a boy. There were other boys there, but mostly they were girls. So I was constantly surrounded by people who were smarter than I was, moved quicker, could think faster, could socialize better. And I was always behind in that circumstance. And I wasn't even sure who my identity was because of that. My mother's family was very strong. My grandmother was very powerful. Didn't have that many male role models. And when I was in university, I became an athlete. I was a rower. And for much of my early life, my identity worked backwards from that identity of sports. So I thought of everything, not just in artistic terms, but also in terms of teamwork, a very kind of linear goal, pain, suffering, collaboration. All those experiences were very, very formative for me. And then finally, I had a long career, a very interesting career in design and in architecture in many places. So not just in the United States, but I lived in Japan for quite some time. I lived in Hong Kong and traveled all over and worked in Asia. Had a lot of my early buildings, mostly in the Middle East and in China. And then I'm now in London. And through all of that, it was especially a time in China, you know, when you're a young architect, Jens, all you want to do is have a chance to do your first high-rise building. It's like the dream of every architect. And in China, there are so many high-rise buildings, they're like weeds. And frankly, nobody pays any attention to them. And they're very ephemeral in a way and commodified. And I got my first high-rise, my second, and then there were dozens of them. And I became less and less interested in the object and more interested in terms of the network of spaces between the buildings, how the urban environment was developed by these objects. So in a funny way, I moved throughout my career from thinking about objects and having to deliver in a very linear way back to where I was as an artist, where you're always trying to see about a network and a system and how all the different parts kind of related to each other through kind of ephemeral ideas about people maybe and non-architectural solutions. So it was really that experience in China, working in my own office with an all Chinese staff, that really started to make me think about how urban systems work. And ever since then, the last 15 years, that's all I've done is really think about urban strategy, urban systems, and how people in place come together. So I guess that's a very quick summary about that.
Interesting story. So how do you merge the different cultures?
Well, this is the very interesting thing, is that we always assume culture is always very defined. And of course, it's not. It's always about relationships. And ultimately, the relationships are human relationships. The values are quite different in the different cultures, obviously. And the most obvious distinction would be Western versus Eastern culture. And I think in my case, I realized that not only were the religious foundations different, but the whole attitude to what was public and private is also very different. So we grow up in the West as an architect, for example, and we understand that there's a very clear boundary between what is public and what is private. And we act in different ways in public and in private. And the public side in particular is really well understood. We get dressed up to go to the theater. We, if we wanted, if Jens, if you and I were in Lucca or something like that, in a nice place in Italy, we might find on a nice day a trattoria, go sit on a table outside in the street, look at all the, pretty and handsome people walking by, take in the scene, people would wave to us as we're eating. That would be a really wonderful experience. That's unimaginable in a lot of Asian cultures. There is no public domain. There's only a domain that is not private. So if we were in China, we might go into a restaurant and if we were lucky, get a nice private room and close the door and really have a nice meal. But the public sphere is not something that is very important in those cultures. So that's probably the very, very first distinction between the two cultures, what is public and what is private. But then, you look at American life and how American cities are designed and the emphasis on the private spaces of the car, for example. And that's a very Eastern experience in a way. And then you see these hybrids like in Shanghai, which have had a relatively long experience of Western activity. And there are hybrids now that are very Western, almost European, in a way that is not really that well understood by a traditional Chinese population, but is well understood by a third culture hybrid population. So there's this blending back and forth. There are cultures that are talking to each other over their systems of how they use the buildings and how they use public space. So that's one big distinction.
Yeah. How was it as a child? How did you find your identity? You started off with, "Hey, I'm American." Have you seen yourself all the time as an American, or was that different while growing up?
Well, I don't think I really saw myself as American until I moved to China. I grew up, and my mother and my grandmother groomed me to be a nice French boy. You know, I wore short trousers until I was well beyond an age where I should have stopped doing that. I was trained to kiss ladies' hands at dinner parties. I had to speak to my mother in French. And so I would, if I wanted to rebel, I would try to speak really badly with a bad accent on purpose, for example.
Mm.
That's pathetic, but that shows, you know, the mind of a poor teenager. And my father, of course, was doing exactly the opposite. He was trying to talk about his past. I wanted very, very much to speak Chinese. I was not trained to speak Chinese when I was younger, so I ended up learning much later when I was in graduate school. And I convinced myself, and you're going to laugh at this, I convinced myself that I looked Chinese. And I finally managed to string a few Chinese words together. And I even went to work in Taiwan for a little while. And then when I moved to Shanghai, I was convinced I was partly Chinese. And of course, the entire world around me in Shanghai did not see me as Chinese at all. There's no way that I could have been Chinese. And I think at the time I was starting to work in China, this would have been in the end of the 90s, and right around 2000, 2001, 2002 is when I moved there full time. It was an amazing time to be in Shanghai, and Shanghai was exploding. It just was skyrocketing in terms of development, economic potential, and everything else. And I understood two things at the same time. First of all, that I actually was not Chinese, that people in China and Shanghai were seeing me as being very Western, very New Yorkish, which was news to me. But the other thing that was interesting was that I suddenly understood how the rest of the world, or how old Europe might have seen America at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, as this brash, powerful, naive culture that was worthy of both contempt and awe at the same time. Because I was actually living in that environment in China, in Shanghai at the time. So I saw China in the way that the West might have seen America. And I understood in a little way what it was to be an American, to have this feeling of outsized potential, of great horizon, a great deal of possibility by moving forward, by taking risks. And that to me, and also to be very open to all sorts of new ideas. And then to me, that became American. And to this day, I sort of understand being an American, my own potential as an American in those terms.
How was the language and your language development in as part of your life influencing your work you're doing? Because maybe to give you a little bit of more depth of that, when I was living in Russia, for example, 3 years, and I've seen when as soon as I learned the language, my interaction with the local culture was changing because I was able to step by step go deeper into the culture. And I mean, in 3 years, you can't really go deep into a culture, but it opened up in a different way, which then allowed me to work differently within in that culture. How was that for you?
Well, that's a good one. First of all, my Chinese never got that good, and it's very, very hard, even for children who learn Chinese from the beginning, to actually speak well. Certainly as a non-native, and even for Chinese themselves, they until they're 12 or 13, they're still learning how to read. It's a very, very different experience to have a non-alphabetic language. But I muddled along, and I tried to be as bilingual as possible. But this is actually, it's funny that you asked this, because it did teach me a lesson. If you have a very restricted vocabulary, as I do and as I did at the time, it's very hard to project yourself forward from wherever you are. You have to work backwards from the limitation that you have.
Mm.
So if I have, 1,000-word vocabulary or 2,000-word vocabulary, not a 10 or a 30,000-word vocabulary, I have to try to define my goals with the language that I have and communicate with that language to the people I work with and socialize with so that I can make myself understood. And that limitation was really annoying at first, but suddenly I realized it was very liberating because it made me think about other people's potential and in a way work with their abilities to gain insights for myself and to achieve my own ends, as opposed to projecting my insights and my abilities onto them and making them react to me. And a more tangible example of this, I mean, architecture and design, it's also a kind of language, right? It's not a verbal language, but there's a syntax, there's a vocabulary, there's a history, a pattern. And I hired some of the very, very best designers that were available at the time in China. They came from the most amazing schools in China, from Tsinghua, in Beijing and Tongji and Shanghai, Fudan, all these great places. But I discovered when they came to my office that it was very frustrating. They were not able to execute what I had in my mind. So, if I had a beautiful building in mind and I said, well, let me just tell you about this building, my idea is this, and the relationship is that. These are concepts, again, we talked a little bit about public and private. These are concepts that might have been very, very well understood in the West, but were not that well understood in the East. And maybe from the building technology point of view or other points of view, they weren't socialized very well. And it was very frustrating. And I thought, this is terrible. I don't have any capability. But then I realized, and it's a little bit like the limitation in language issue, I would ask them, well, what could they design? What did they like to think about? What was an exemplary solution from their own point of view and their own experience? And many of them were not what I had done. I would not have valued them. But since it was something that they could do very, very well, I said, okay, this is my language. I now have in my toolbox a different set of tools. Some of them were more limited than what I had before. Some of them were a little bit more extensive, but I'm going to recombine those capabilities, those symbols, those solutions, and use them as grammar and vocabulary to make my own. So I think the language issue is hugely important, but it made me realize that actually the greatest potential comes from when you have a limitation to begin with. And you accept the limitation and you use those limitations to create a language that then allows you to connect to a broader range of people than you might have otherwise.
Yeah. Love it. And that's a great opening looking towards innovation. So, I mean, you have been working a lot in the last years with urban development. How would you, and I would like you to take a step towards that when you look into innovation. What is your definition of innovation in this environment?
Well, innovation is often combined with the idea of imagination. And we have a very romantic idea about what our potential is in relation to imagination. We see creativity, the work of great artists, as tied to imagination. They have superior imaginations. He or she can create things solely out of their imagination. But to me, I'm beginning to realize that that's a fallacy. It's a little bit like going into a strange culture with your own language and trying to project it out forward and finding that it doesn't actually have any traction. And I started to realize, mostly from my experience in foreign cultures, working in places that I was not familiar with, that my insights came from random accidents. random encounters with the banal world around me or the limitations around me. And that combination of the external circumstance colliding with my own experience is what created the insight. And so when I think about innovation, urban innovation, I think about the power of the city, for example, to create these random experiences for people who live there because of the chance conversation that you may have with an unexpected person in the street, the surprise and delight when you turn a corner in a slightly unfamiliar place and you see something for the first time. I realize that that's where innovation comes from. It is from the randomness of our experience tied to our experience. Randomness combined with our experience and that turbulent space in between that innovation happens.
Yeah. If you take this into like the situations that are, or the places that are out there and cities looking into the future development, what is working and what's not working in that context right now in your experience?
Well, the secret of cities, of course, is that people are not attracted to beautiful buildings. They're not attracted to great transit systems. They're not attracted to smart technology. The secret of cities is that people are attracted to other people. And the cities that are out there that are working, that are attractive to people like you or like me, are the cities that are working, and they are because they are attracting people just like us. And then the limitation is that if you and I are too similar to each other, we will not be innovating because we're not creating the randomness. So the cities that are out there that are doing really, really well have lots of people like us already there, but also lots of people who are not like us who are already there. And it is basically promising us the chance for randomness and opportunity. And for that, you need size. It's very, very hard to get that kind of diversity out of a very small population. And until very recently, the only way to get that scale is through urban density. And in particular, the number of social exchanges you might have over the course of a day. And then you can start to say, okay, well, the cities that create the most potential exchanges over the course of the day through public transport. So for example, public transport allows that to come together, are the ones that are the most successful. And if you look at all the urban rankings, competitivity rankings, innovation rankings, investment measures, social attractions, all sorts of things, they typically go to the densest cities. And I would say you have to get up over the 1-2 million mark as a minimum. And then when you have another measure, which is how long do you spend as your daily commute? And there's a crazy, crazy idea out there, which I think is amazing. It's called exposure time. And there are a couple of people who theorize about this. And it may be something that is hardwired in us as human beings. But basically, we have an exposure time of 30 or 45 minutes, which is basically what we accept as a maximum commuting time in order to maintain some level of happiness. And this may relate back to our evolutionary antecedents when we were running away from saber-toothed tigers or something, but we had to be out foraging for food. And if we weren't out there long enough, we didn't get enough food. And if we were out there too long, we were eaten up by the saber-toothed tiger. And funnily enough, this feeling, the 45-minute commute, or say, call it an hour total, is still with us today. You know, people who are outside of that hour commuting are typically really unhappy, or maybe they love ponies and they have to live in a place where they can keep ponies. But basically the sweet spot is under the hour. So then you have big cities, lots of potential, but that somehow in terms of size are under an hour in diameter. And then you just start looking across cities all around the world. The ones that are working are all in this sweet spot. We're now living in an age, just as we're doing right now, where we may have some disruptions to this. Yeah. So you and I are more than an hour away from each other, but we speak to each other regularly. And we speak to our friends in this way regularly. And so this technology may be seeding some areas that normally would not be innovation incubators, that would allow them to kind of maybe not jump to the top rank, but certainly climb in terms of their potential, because they can create randomness in a population that is not that diverse.
Yeah, that's it. It's an interesting way of thinking. I was just, while you have been saying that, it was because I'm now living in a fairly small village. And as you said, the attractiveness is people. And what you see, especially with all the lockdown things happening right now, at least in Germany, it's like people love to meet each other. In a way that, I mean, that's natural, of course, but you see it's like they're trying to reach out to each other in a way that they normally don't do. And then I've been living in Moscow as well, where some of my employees and team members have been traveling 2 hours to work. I mean, and of course, a lot is because of the traffic, but it's basically 4 hours per day gone just to get to work back and forth.
Well, they're probably not very happy about it.
Yeah.
But what happens to cities when they get too big, and again, size is measured by time, is they typically split, they divide. So Moscow can be like that. Istanbul can be like that. Cairo can be like that. They're large conurbations, but often what ends up happening is that they split into zones that are smaller within an hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in Istanbul, you have, east and west, for example, but other cities do it in different ways. And then those clusters, those halves start to specialize and create their own attractions. They may become qualitatively different from each other.
Yeah. It's very interesting thoughts. I would love to go a little bit towards entrepreneurship now. So you have been working for large corporations and you have been running your own business and founded the OUTCOMIST. Before we go into the OUTCOMIST, how is it from your experience working in these different settings? One part is in a large organization and starting your own business.
Well, I started out as an architect dreaming that I would be working, by myself in a small little cabin, having deep thoughts and, drawing and then, pushing out some giant, perfectly formed idea. And of course, that is definitely not the life of a real architect, that you have to sort of work with other people and communicate with them. And I've worked I had a small architecture firm when I was younger. I've worked in a series of progressively larger firms. And I think I was always attracted to large firms because instinctively I knew that there would be diversity there. There would always be people like me there, even if there are a lot of people who are not like me there as well. And I went to architecture school that was huge, and it was almost like a city in itself. And the last firm I worked with was enormous. It had, over 90,000 staff. That's practically a city.
Yeah.
And I liked the diversity there because I knew that within that huge firm, I could specialize very, very hard and draw to me people who also wanted that specialization. And that would have been harder to achieve in a very small firm, where unless it was already very, very specialized, wouldn't have the diversity to kind of innovate along those lines. So when I founded OUTCOMIST, it was really to continue this hard specialization on urban strategy, the combination of design and stakeholder management. And I was already doing that in my larger firm. And it was just an opportunity to kind of focus on it and make it a very, very pure environment just to deal with that subject. But to a certain extent, I was already doing that within a much larger firm, but with many more distractions. So Of course, life is very, very different. You don't have the big machine working for you, but you also don't have the constant calls on your attention to take over management or to address issues that are not really core to the mission. So in some ways, it's very similar to the work that I had in very, very big companies. And obviously the working environment is very, very different.
Yeah. What I realized over the last year, specifically in leaving a very large corporation 2 years ago and starting my own world, especially now in this life where we're in a digital version, it feels like I have a lot of employees, though they're not my employees, because we're able to connect easily, like we do on a bi-weekly basis at least. It's quite interesting because you still have the randomness and possibilities to connect to people who built on your ideas, give you inspirational things which you can implement in your business, even if they're not in your own business.
That's true. I think in those circumstances, especially when you don't have those staff members directly around you, or you don't have them in a way that is overtly under your control directly, you inevitably have a different skill, which is you have to network. And obviously technology helps with some of that, but you constantly have to be putting out assignments in terms that will be attractive to them.
Mm.
So in my case, I keep going back to this experience I had in China. I have to constantly reimagine everything I want in terms of other people's needs and other people's language.
Yeah.
And if I don't do that, I don't connect to them and they don't engage with me.
It's always. It's like, because I'm coaching quite a lot. When I coach owners of business, I say, forget to sell, focus only on giving and focus on connecting, and the sale will come. That's a
Yeah,
bit towards that direction. And
yeah,
I
I
think
think that's very true.
in this time where we are in right now with all the lockdowns, and if you're, let's say, for 5 to 10 people's business, that's even more important to do, because you can't go to a conference, you can't go to the local club which is meeting from a business perspective. You need to do this actively and reaching out to people to build groups and build environments where you connect to people or you connect other people together.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also, and maybe this is something from my own sporting background, you can train yourself
Yes.
to do that. It's some people think, oh, well, she's really good at it because she just grew up that way. But it's a muscle. It's a kind of social muscle. And it's important to get mentored and to have mentorship and to be coached, because like anything else, you have to know the drills, you have to practice, you have to then from time to time test yourself, measure yourself, and then in the next encounter, 3 months later, compare how you did then to how you did before. It's a muscle. It's something that we have to train.
Yeah.
And I think that ability to empathize is not always just natively born. It's something that we can learn about and develop on our own and with some help, for sure.
Yeah, I really focus on that too. So let's dive into the Outcomist, your business. First of all, I need to understand, how did you get to that name?
Well, I, for all sorts of reasons, I was reading a little bit about over the years about Stoic philosophers, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and I remember reading about them, Michel de Montaigne, all these people. And part of what a good Stoic does is and this doesn't, I don't mean this to sound morbid in any way, but even from a very, very young age, the Stoic imagines his or her own death.
Mm.
And they imagine, what is their death like? Who is around them when they are dying? What do they see? who are the people in the room? What have they accomplished in their life? And then they think, okay, to get to that point, what do I need to have done 1 minute before then, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 year, 1 decade, 50 years before that time? And the idea is that you don't move forward from the present and imagining without any experience what you will be able to do. You imagine where you want to be, what is the outcome you want to achieve, and you work backwards from the outcome. Because if you don't go through that exercise, you will never know how to move forward. So I just started to think about that, about the outcome first, and then the next step at the end. And I just thought, well, that's kind of how I've been thinking and acting in the last few years. And I wanted to make a company and a practice that really emphasized that philosophy. So before we think about the strategy about how we accomplish something, oh, we want to make a great city, and the inputs for the city are transit and high rises and parks and a little incubator neighborhood. But these are all strategies to move forward. But what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? Is it happiness? Or is it a little bit more social mixing? Maybe you accomplish that without any infrastructure. You just invite 3 people who don't live in that neighborhood to move in, and you think about what you're really trying to accomplish before you start to embark on a strategy. So that's how OUTCOMIST started. And the projects that I'm doing now are really using that as a philosophy. And it really is kind of like being a psychiatrist for a city mayor. Tell me more about your city. Oh, really? Why is it that you want to do this in your city? What are you trying to achieve? And then we can come up with a strategy.
Yeah. So how would an engagement work? Imagine I'm now in Germany. Let's say I'm the mayor of Berlin, and I like your way of thinking. How would the engagement work?
Well, if I'm the mayor of Berlin and I've been hired by the mayor, rather, if you're the mayor of Berlin and you've hired me, I first of all would probably sit down with you very quietly and try to figure out what exactly is on your mind. Not just in terms of what you want to achieve, but what your anxieties are, just like any good psychiatrist would do. And so, what are you afraid of? Why do you think you're failing? How could you get more friends? How could you reconcile your relationship with your enemies? How can you gain support? And all of these very, very human desires and anxieties have analogs in the physical world. You want more friends? What you're really saying is you want it easier for your friends to find you and communicate with you. Well, that's usually like transportation and land adjacency. You want to have more potential for yourself. Well, that usually has to do about increasing your human capital and finding ways to trade and exchange more effectively through transit hubs and movement of people and industry. So I basically will start with that kind of interview, and then I would set up a series of workshops with as many stakeholders as I can. And in this workshop, I would lead people through exercises. We would have breakout sessions, creative problem solving among group members. But very, very important is to take the cultures of everybody there and break them up and mix them so that everyone has a chance to understand whatever the issue is from someone else's point of view, and to be able to test the idea using other people's language and not their own. And then usually at the end of this process, which is very, very intensive, but it's quite short, it's like usually anywhere between 1 to 3 days, simply by listening and trying to understand what people want versus what they say they want, I end up having these insights and an understanding about how the city works and what the mayor works, much more than the mayor himself or herself would have, and more than any individual stakeholder might have. And that's only through the process of active listening and getting people to work together and to solve problems together. And then from then on, it's fairly straightforward. It could be an urban master planning project. It could be an economic development project. It could just be a simple program management project for one aspect or the other. That ends up being a more traditional delivery. But the insight, the real value, is in that very, very intensive session up front.
Yeah. So if you imagine, it's like, do you have a dream city, a dream mayor, or a dream customer client in that way, where you say, I would love to develop that city?
Well, I think, of course, I love mayors. Mayors are extraordinary individuals because they are dealing with a polity, a size of interests and population that is really more interesting than a building and more interesting than a nation. You know, cities are becoming more important than nations. Urban territories are becoming more important than nations, and mayors are really at that point. So frankly, any mayor or any city that wants to improve some aspect of their life or their ambition is interesting. What's starting to happen now, Jens, is that we are having these structures that are kind of neo-urban, that are not really formally or legally defined as a city, but start to operate in a very urban way. So you might have an urban corridor, say in the United States, that's stretching from, say, Washington to Boston along a narrow line. And it's really straddling not, 3 or 4 major cities, but lots of urbanized little micro areas along the way. I would love, for example, to work on defining these corridors in existing regions. So for example, if you're living in a small town, it's not urban in a city sense, but that small town, enabled by technology, communicating in a very specialized way with a little constellation of other small towns within this idea of, say, a 60-minute travel radius, starts to become really interesting. So my dream would be to work with these groups to define these areas as special economic zones and make it a neo-city. Or I've already specialized quite a bit on airport cities. So for example, the industrial clusters and social population groups around major airports, creating a kind of neo-urban environment. These are not cities, but they often work as concessions under a singular leadership. They have a property angle. They trade and exchange in ways that go beyond simple aviation. It has to do with specialization. I love doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, cool. Slowly getting towards an end. So I have a couple of questions which I ask everyone on the show. If you would have the possibility to work with a project that's recognized and that's attaching all human beings on Earth, so like everyone will get to know that, everyone will be attached to that, or has the outcome of that, what project would it be and why?
It's a very good question. And it also addresses a real challenge that we have in our life today. And that is, we do not have shared experience that we might have had a generation ago. And the good news about the way information is socialized is that we can select any issue that we want and join people who think exactly in the same way, or attract people who think exactly in the same way. And we've never had that capability before, ever, to the extent that we have now. But the disadvantage of that is, for better or for worse, it doesn't create a kind of shared experience that we can at least understand, may not feel comfortable in, but we can understand is also a shared experience for other people. And I would say any project that can create shared experience is something worth having. I personally think it would be very interesting to develop the idea of national service for young people, and find initiatives that young people can do together that would cause them to be in a shared environment with people who are not like them, but to accomplish an objective that would be shared. So this is something which is still, relatively common in Europe and in other parts of the world, and is almost absent in other parts of the world, including the United States. And it doesn't have to be just military service. You can teach, you can work the land, you can help all sorts of other groups. And I think as long as there are not too many choices, there are a handful of choices that are quite diverse. But I think it would be very, very interesting to do something like that, to create projects that involve young people and start to create the foundations of shared experience that could then be turned into a social contract in some other way later on.
Love that. And that's, I think, also interesting a little bit to the cultures you have mentioned before. People stepping out of their own culture, understanding or learning to understand other cultures and other perspectives, which I think we're also not too good all over the world right now. Next questions. Looking forward, where do you think you will be in a year from now? And you can say that from a personal perspective and or business perspective, as you wish.
Well, I love the work that I do because it is now both theoretical and strategic, as well as sort of spatial and very physical. And I honestly, as long as I can keep doing this forever, I would be very, very happy. I also, in the last year, given the pandemic situation, I've actually found the time to be very liberating. I like routines. I like application and sort of very task-oriented work, but I also like the idea of having lots and lots of time to think about who I want to connect with, as opposed to always reacting to people. So I would like to have more of that, or at least a continuation of that in a year's time. I think OUTCOMIST is, I don't want it to grow into a pure delivery organization. I want it to be a very, very focused consultancy that's really bringing together not only my expertise, but my partner's expertise in economics and transport policy, as well as physical urban design and architecture. So I think to be able to grow our network of clients and our geographies would be a very, very good goal, or rather an outcome for a year or 10 years from now. So just working backwards from that outcome, I know the kinds of people that I'm trying to attract to OUTCOMIST.
Yeah. How do you keep yourself up to date and informed about interesting topics?
Well, forums like this are really good because if I'm in an environment where people are asking me questions that I haven't really considered before, I'm gaining insight from that. You and I are part of discussion groups where we are regularly challenged. And what makes it challenging isn't so much that there are lots of people who have our exact same backgrounds, but there are people who have very different backgrounds who have suddenly been thrown onto a shared space trying to solve things in a certain way. So I think that that's going to be a really, really big part of it. I think in terms of learning, I love moderating as well as speaking on panels or in seminars or in conferences where I know nothing about the subject, because it is that massive, massive learning curve that actually allows us to both learn something new, but to gain insight onto what we already know. So I speak very regularly at conferences, both keynote but I really like moderating at these conferences because it allows me to sort of play around with the symbols of what is being discussed, as well as the ideas, and use them as building blocks to create different kinds of understanding and different kinds of structures.
Yeah, great. Where can people find you and reach out to you? How can they reach out to you?
Well, I think I love Instagram more than life itself. And so they can always find me on Instagram, C_Choa, so C_CHOA. My website, OUTCOMIST.net, and also on LinkedIn. There are not very many Christopher Choas out there, so they'll find me that way very easily.
And I will also put the links in the show notes so people can click and find you. Any last departing words from you? Anything you want to let the viewers and listeners know?
Well, I just think the world is an astonishing place. And I would say, especially to younger people, I have rarely in my life ever imagined a world that is as exciting as it is right now. I'm extremely hopeful, actually. I'm very optimistic. We are extremely conscious of all the challenges, but we are in a time of great transition. And as long as we can manage somehow to open our spirits up to this change, it's an extraordinary world. If we're simply trying to preserve a way of life as a backwards view, I don't think it's a very interesting place. But I am particularly optimistic, especially for young people in this environment.
Cool. Thank you very much, Chris, for being on the show.
All right, Jens, thank you so much for inviting me. I really
See you
enjoyed
next time.
it. Yeah, take care.
Bye.
Take me to another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical, magical land, magical, magical land. To another place where the fairy tales don't end.